At Hollandia Air Base in Dutch New Guinea, in the early summer of 1944, the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group already knew what a long mission felt like in a P-38 Lightning. The cockpit was a hot metal cocoon. The seat was a parachute on top of a cramped bucket. The life raft jammed under their backs, the Pacific sun pouring through the canopy. Lindbergh turned this insight into an obsession. Surveying routes for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, he spent thousands of hours treating each flight as a laboratory. He experimented with low-revolution crews, with lean mixtures, with different manifold pressures at different altitudes. He learned that safe settings were often wasteful, that engines ran cooler at lower revolutions than pilots assumed, and that careful management could stretch range by margins that looked like magic to those who trusted rule of thumb instead of arithmetic. But while his technical authority grew, his political judgment faltered. As Europe slid toward war, Lindbergh used his fame to argue that the United States should stay out of the conflict. His speeches for the America First Committee and his willingness to praise certain aspects of German aviation turned him into a symbol of isolationism. President Franklin Roosevelt came to despise him. In the spring of 1941, after Roosevelt publicly compared him to a notorious Civil War copperhead, Lindbergh resigned his Army Air Corps Reserve Commission. When Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into global war, he tried to come back in uniform. Roosevelt personally made sure that would not happen. Yet technical skill has a way of leaking past politics. Aircraft companies and the services that bought from them could not ignore a man who had spent his life squeezing miles out of engines. Lindbergh re-entered the war not as Colonel Lindbergh, but as Mr. Lindbergh, a civilian consultant for United Aircraft and other firms. He helped solve production problems on B-24 Liberators. He flew high-altitude test missions in P-47 Thunderbolts, mapping their performance envelopes. With chance fought, he experimented with dive bombing procedures for the F-4U Corsair and showed Marine pilots how to take off with bomb loads that previously had seemed suicidal. In every case, he approached aviation as a system. Power settings, temperatures, weights, margins. Still, he wanted more than test flying. He wanted to see combat up close. And somewhere over the South Pacific, he realized that his lifelong obsession with range might answer a very wartime question. How much farther could an American fighter go if someone truly ruthless about fuel management worked out the numbers? By early 1944, United Aircraft had a particular interest in twin-engine fighters. The only American example that really mattered in the Pacific was Lockheed's P-38 Lightning, a fast, heavy, long-legged machine whose twin booms and central pod made it instantly recognizable. Its range already made it the workhorse of 5th Air Force's long-range operations. But pilots complained that even with external tanks, they were flying to the limit, touching targets with almost no fuel left to spare. Lindbergh persuaded United Aircraft and sympathetic officers to send him west as a technical representative, officially to observe P-38 operations. Quietly, he hoped to do more. He left the United States in civilian clothes, carrying a naval-style uniform without insignia and a pocket-sized New Testament that he noted in his journal was now his single chosen book, something, he reflected, that would not have been true a decade earlier. The trip was authorized by the Navy Department, but carefully hidden from the White House. Even the Secretary of the Navy did not know that the most famous pilot in America was headed into the combat zone. In the South Pacific, he began, as always, by watching and listening. Marine aviators flying Corsairs invited him along on observation missions that very quickly turned into real combat sorties. On one of his first, near the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, he went in low with guns armed, strafing ground targets and feeling the familiar, cold focus of risk settle in. When the Marines realized he was more than a celebrity tourist that he could analyze takeoff accidents, recalculate safe weight limits, and show them how to haul double bomb loads off rough coral strips without flipping into the sea, their skepticism turned into respect. Word spread. By June, he had his eyes on the Lightning. He knew the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, had built a fierce reputation in New Guinea. If he wanted to understand long-range P-38 operations, that was the unit to join. He hitched rides forward, ate with staff officers, and on the 20th of June climbed into a P-38 for his first checkout flight. Less than a week later, he walked through the screen door of a makeshift rec hall at Hollandia, interrupting a checkers game between the group commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, and the operations officer Merrill Smith. MacDonald was a young man by Lindbergh standards, 29 years old, already a 10-victory ace, commanding a hard-flying outfit that had been in continuous combat since its activation in Australia the previous year. To him, the name at the door sounded almost unreal. Charles Lindbergh, not a story in a schoolbook or a face in an old newsreel, but a tired, sunburnt civilian standing in the doorframe, asking politely to discuss P-38 operations. At first, MacDonald tried to brush him off. The group had missions to fly and lives to worry about. Fame did not count for much against maintenance schedules and weather fronts. Then Lindbergh explained that he carried authorization from higher headquarters to observe and advise on lightning performance. MacDonald thought for a moment and then did something generous and entirely practical. He invited the civilian to fly the next day's mission. If Lindbergh wanted to talk about lightning tactics and engines, he could start by sitting in the same cockpit as everyone else. On the morning of the 27th of June, under a low, sullen sky, Lindbergh strapped into a P-38 as Blue 3 in a four-ship led by MacDonald and including aces like Tom Maguire and Merrill Smith. Any idea that he would be treated gently vanished as soon as the throttles went forward. The target area around Jeffman Island was defended by anti-aircraft guns and scattered enemy positions. The flight-hunted barges dropped low to strafe, weaved through tracers. Lindbergh flew tight on Maguire's wing, his gunnery steady, his formation work precise. When they returned hours later, he had passed the first and most basic test of any outsider in combat. He had not been a burden. Then the crew chiefs checked his fuel. After successive sorties, the pattern hardened. Mission after mission, Lindbergh's aircraft taxied in with significantly more gasoline in its tanks than those of the men on his wing. He was not babying the aircraft. He was fighting when they fought, staying with the formation. Yet when others came back scraping the bottom of their reserves, he rolled to a stop with a cushion of fuel that made the maintenance sergeants shake their heads. MacDonald was no engineer, but he knew what he was seeing. Extra fuel at the end of a mission meant options, time to divert around storms, to cover a damaged bomber a few minutes longer, to search for a pilot who had gone into the water. In a theater built on long distances, roughly 30 inches of mercury to maintain cruise power. Move the mixture control from auto-rich to auto-lean, allowing just enough fuel for complete combustion. Hold an indicated airspeed in the neighborhood of 185 miles per hour. At those settings, he explained, the Lightning's fuel consumption dropped dramatically, down into the vicinity of 70 gallons per hour, without yielding much in speed or altitude capability. Over the length of a typical long-range mission, the savings translated into hundreds of miles. In mathematical terms, the combat radius of the P-38 could jump from roughly 570 miles to 700, even 750, with realistic allowances for fighting over the target and landing with a responsible reserve. For many in the room, this was heresy. From the day they first sat in a trainer cockpit, pilots had been warned never to run over square, never to combine relatively low revolutions with comparatively high manifold pressure. Instructors had painted vivid verbal pictures of cylinder heads glowing red, pistons shattering, engines seizing in sudden, catastrophic failure. Low RPM and high boost, they were told, would hammer bearings, cook valves, and send them into the ocean. Now a civilian, however famous, was calmly suggesting they spend hours exactly in that supposedly dangerous regime. The silence after his talk was heavy. Some men traded skeptical looks. Others stared at the floor, doing rough mental arithmetic in their heads. 9-hour missions, 700-plus miles from base. Long minutes circling over a target with empty oceans stretching in all directions. Even for those who trusted the math, the human cost sounded brutal. The P-38 cockpit was already a test of endurance at 7 hours. Adding 2 more felt like a sentence. MacDonald cut through the discomfort with a simple decision. They would test it. Not on the longest missions, not all at once, but step by step. If the engines ran hot, they would see it on the gauges. If there were trouble, The twin-engine design of the Lightning gave them at least a chance of limping home. And if it worked, they would have something no Japanese unit could match, a fighter that could go where the enemy believed fighters could not reach. The first trials were cautious. Pilots tried the low RPM, high manifold, lean mixture combination on local flights close to Hollandia, ready to turn back at the first hint of detonation. To their surprise, the engines ran smoothly. The sound changed. The deep, throbbing beat of the Allisons became slower, heavier, but temperatures did not spike. Oil pressure stayed where it should. Cylinder head temperatures, the critical indicator of destructive combustion, often dropped a bit compared to the old high-revolution cruise. Slowly, confidence grew. When they pushed the technique onto real combat sorties, the results were impossible to deny. On a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance along the western shore of Guinea Bay, Lindbergh returned with more than 200 gallons still in his tanks. Other pilots on the same mission, flying more traditional settings, came back with needles hovering near zero. On a later strike and barge hunt near Jeffman Island, 2 pilots broke off early, worried by their dwindling fuel. Lindbergh, flying the same path, stayed over the target. He had the luxury of time. Within weeks, the new cruise method spread through the group. Pilots who had mocked the idea found themselves using Lindbergh's settings whenever the route stretched far out over water. Missions that once allowed only a few tight minutes over the objective now included a margin for hunting barges, strafing airfields, or circling for late-arriving bombers. The P-38's effective combat radius expanded not on paper, but in the lived experience of men who suddenly realized they could see distant islands and still come home with fuel in the tanks. Lindbergh did not stay in the classroom. He continued to fly with the 475th. Wearing a simple headset and using the radio call sign Mr. Lindbergh, he flew as wingman, as element leader, even occasionally freelancing when targets appeared. In late July, he found himself in the most intense episode of his combat time with the group. Escorting bombers near Sarum, his flight tangled with 2 Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya light bombers. One was flown by Captain. Among the pilots, however, the verdict was simple. The civilian had just done what they did. He had looked an enemy in the eye and fired first. A few days later, the war almost collected on its temperature and individual aircraft, but the principle remained: slower revolutions, moderate manifold pressure, lean mixture. Pilots watching their gauges on long legs to the Philippines, to Morotai, to the islands that would form General Douglas MacArthur's stepping stones back toward Luzon, found that they could keep fighters over convoys and beaches longer than before. Bombers that once crossed the last miles alone now had lightning cover, not just for the run-in, but for the vulnerable climb-out. The improvement was not small. The P-38's internal fuel load, combined with drop tanks, now yielded missions pushing 9 hours and distances near 1,000 miles. In practical terms, that meant commanders planning operations were no longer bound to the same narrow circle around existing airfields. Some islands once considered essential solely because they lay within fighter range could be bypassed, their garrisons isolated rather than assaulted. Others could be attacked sooner because fighters could reach them from bases farther back. The calendar of the Pacific War shifted by weeks and months, and part of that shift came not from new aircraft or new factories, but from a different way of pulling the same throttles. There were doubters, of course. Some maintenance officers worried that long-term use of over-square settings would quietly shorten engine life, and in a sense they were right. The technique accepted a trade-off. But the Pacific was awash in crates of spare Allison engines, and the calculus of war is cruel. An engine that wore out a little sooner but brought its pilot home from an 8-hour mission had done its job. Field reports showed no spike in in-flight engine failures. What changed was what? Missions were possible. In time, the Army Air Forces absorbed the lesson into official doctrine. Updated cruise charts appeared. Training materials began to describe lean-of-peak mixture operation, and lower RPM cruise as tools, not taboos. Many later pilots would learn the technique without ever hearing Lindbergh's name in connection with it. On paper, it became just one more line in a manual. Yet among the men who had flown with him, the memory was personal. They remembered a 42-year-old civilian who refused special treatment, who sat sweating in the same cramped cockpit on the Same 7-hour hauls, and who explained his ideas not with mystique, but with patient argument and personal example. He did not lecture them about their duty. He showed them his own fuel gauges after landing. He risked his life on the same missions his math justified. That combination, knowledge, humility, and proof, broke down resistance that orders from above could not have touched. Lindbergh's Pacific service did not erase the controversies of his earlier politics. Even decades later, historians would argue over his speeches, his judgments, and the way his fame had once mixed uneasily with power. But in the narrow, unforgiving world of the long-range fighter pilot, those debates faded against a simpler measure. Did a man help them do their job better and survive? In the case of Charles Lindbergh at Hollandia, the answer was yes. When he died in the mid-1970s, far from New Guinea on the quiet slopes of Maui, his grave was marked with a plain slab of concrete and a line from a psalm about taking the wings of the morning and dwelling in the uttermost parts of the sea. It was an image he had lived twice, once alone over the Atlantic, and once again, in middle age, over the vast Pacific beside younger men and twin-engine fighters. In both cases, the thread that connected his journeys was the same. He believed that machines had more to give if someone cared enough to learn how they truly worked, if someone questioned the safe answers and then proved better ones in the hardest possible way. In the end, that is his legacy in the Pacific. Not the single unofficial victory, not the handful of dramatic dogfights, but the quiet revolution of numbers on a fuel gauge. He arrived in New Guinea as a controversial celebrity and a civilian outsider. He left as a comrade whose techniques stretched the reach of the P-38, saved aircraft and crews, and showed that in modern war, the decisive edge can come not from louder slogans or heavier armor, but from understanding. Someone in a cockpit, doing the math, and turning the impossible distance into just another leg home.